Hi, I'm Lenora Bresler. Welcome to the January 29th, 2017 edition of The Bible, Delight in the Details. Now, we are in a multi-session series talking about how to look at a Bible passage, and we've talked about the importance of prayer and different tools that you can use, and we've looked at that when you're looking at a passage, you should pay special attention to details, including when something happened, where it happened, and the names of the people involved. Today we want to look at the beginning of two sessions talking about that you need to consider what is before and what is after the passage you are considering, because that can give you context and an understanding. And a lot of times it is this juxtaposition of maybe two events that really bring clarity to the meaning of each of them. Let me give you one example today. And that is the example of Jesus and Zaccheus, the rich young ruler, and then Zaccheus. Now, we see the story of the rich young ruler in three of the Gospels. In Mark chapter 10, 17 to 31, Matthew 19, 16 to 30, and Luke 18 to 23. In Luke, we also see that it is right up against, in fact, the story that immediately follows the story of the rich young ruler is Zaccheus, Luke 19. And so the question is, what do these two stories have to say about one another? Well, in looking at what comes before and after a biblical passage, we are not helped, frankly, by the chapters and the verse divisions. The chapters only came into being in the late Middle Ages and the verses in the early part of the Renaissance. Before that time, the only divisions that there were the books. So it was much easier, I think, for Christians of an earlier era to see those connections because there weren't these artificial, although grantedly very beneficial and helpful, divisions. It is human nature when we see a chapter ending to stop at the end of the chapter. And for example, in the case of the rich young ruler and Zaccheus, those two stories are separated in Luke by the end of a chapter. Zaccheus is in 19 and the rich young ruler story is in 18. So we lose that connection generally. But you really can understand it better when you read it together. Now, if you remember, in the story of the rich young ruler, Jesus is on the move, as he always is, as a rabbi on the move. And he is approached by a rich young ruler who asks him, "What must I do?" Emphasis on action, emphasis on a person doing something to be right with God. "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Christ, knowing him, asks him questions like, "Well, are you following the 10 Commandments, etc.?" And he says, "Oh, yes, these things I've done since I was a boy." And other people in the crowd were not questioning that. They were not calling him a hypocrite. I'm sure he really had. He was probably a very good guy from a moral standpoint. He was following the law. And then Jesus, knowing his heart, knowing that he did have an idol in his heart that was not God, and he knew that in that case it was money, he said, "Well, go and sell all you have, give it to the poor, and then come follow me." And we're told that the young man went away sad. And it's very important that one of the things you look at when you look at a Bible passage is you ask yourself, what ancient heresies, what misunderstanding of God is being dealt with in the Bible and is still being dealt with today. And I want to talk to you about the prosperity gospel, because that's exactly what this rich young man was having difficulty with. If you believe in the prosperity gospel, that is that if you are making money, you're in good health, your family is all getting along, then that means you're blessed, and that means you're in right relationship with God. And if any of those things starts to suffer, then obviously you're sinning and you are no longer blessed by God. That is the prosperity gospel, and it is wrong. It is not what is being taught, and I urge you in the strongest possible terms to get out from under that kind of teaching. It is a heresy, it is incorrect, and it's been around for many, many years. Even Jesus had to deal with this. And that's what he was dealing with here with the rich young ruler. Because in that day, people believed that if you were wealthy and healthy and young and had great status, then clearly you must be favored by God. You know, the whole book of Job is about that. A good man, a very good and godly man, who for no reason was struck down in many ways. And it did not mean that he was not loved and blessed by God. In fact, the fact that he stood up under that and refused to bend, refused to curse God, was a great testament to his faith. But you know, many, many people, that's when they lose their faith in God. They think God has mistreated them in some way, that they didn't deserve something that happened to them, that God has to give them worldly blessings if they do certain things for God. And that is not the promise. You know, I just saw on a church billboard recently here in town, it said, you know, God promised us a safe landing, but not a calm passage. And that is absolutely so true. Well, this man and the people around him, this rich young ruler, had bought into this prosperity gospel, so to speak, of an earlier era. And they could not understand why Jesus didn't just accept this man. I mean, after all, he was following the law. Apparently, no one was denying that. And then, you know, people were asking themselves, well, you know, who in the world is going to be able to be saved if somebody like this dude, who seems to have it all together and be so obviously, they would say, blessed by God, if that's not good enough for Jesus? Well, then immediately we have the story of Zaccheus. Zaccheus was, to anybody's eyes, a sinner. He was a tax collector, and in that era, tax collectors were notorious for adding on unjustified gains and lining their pockets illegally and unjustly. And the Jewish people hated them because they felt like they were betraying their own people. Zaccheus, however, whose name, by the way, interestingly, means pure and good, was a man who understood his sin and yet wanted to have a relationship with God. And what did he do? Remember, he's the little guy. He climbs up into the sycamore tree, which, by the way, he thought Jesus might have paused under the sycamore tree. That's why he was up there. He thought Jesus walking along might have paused in the sycamore tree, because that's where rabbis and teachers often stopped, by a sycamore tree, because sycamore trees have all these low-lying branches. It made it very easy for people to climb there and use them as chairs and places to rest and listen to a rabbi. That's why he climbed the sycamore tree, by the way. But what happened? Jesus goes along and he accepts him. He accepts him because, whereas he didn't, the rich young ruler, because he realized that this little Zaccheus guy, he was truly blessed. He was in right relationship with God, even though to outward appearance it might not appear. So please remember this. Remember that there are mistakes that people have made for millennium about God, and they're still making it today. So many of the passages in the Bible are very relevant because they remind us that we keep making, as human beings, the same mistakes about God and what it means to be in right relationship with Him over and over and over again. We are to read the rich young ruler and the story of Zaccheus together. How do you get right with God? Not as the rich young ruler thought, by action, but as Zaccheus understood somehow inherently. And that is, you must see Jesus, you must hear Him, and you must be in relationship with Him. We'll have more on how to read a Bible passage by looking at what comes immediately before and immediately after tomorrow on the next edition of the Bible. Delight in the details. Make it a great day.